Hey, it's Tuna the Guru, and in today's video, I am going to take you through the process of how I burnish my edges of my leather bags, belts, straps, etc. using latex paint. So today's paint, we're going to use a paint from Angelus. In another video, I'm going to do a review on some of their paints and give you my personal professional opinion. But today we're going to use a paint from the Neon collection because the straps match a neon bag that I put together. So I'm going to take you through the entire process of how I do this. It is a not conventional process, but it works well. It's a process that I've been doing ever since I started making bags. And as far as I know, I'm the only person who does it. So today I'm giving you my secrets, at least one of them. So just make sure you stay tuned through the whole video because throughout the video, I'm going to be giving you tips and tricks, and you're going to need the visual aids in order to really keep up with the technique so you can understand exactly what I'm telling you and why I'm telling you what I'm telling you. It's a really good trick to have in your arsenal. Personally, I like to have my edges match the color of my bag because to me, I feel like it gives it more of a polished, finished look, and it just helps with the continuity of the whole design piece. So, yep, that's it. Let's get started. So to get started, you want to make sure that you're fully prepped and you have all of your materials in front of you. Today, I am working with a Neon Angelus paint, as well as a plastic hand burnisher. For me, I prefer burnishing by hand. I'm using a white candle here instead of beeswax. I'll explain why later. I'm using a fine tip paintbrush, a lighter, and you want to have the item that you're working on. So here is the raw edge of a strap that I'm working on. You can see the raw leather, and on top of that, I've glued a piece of finished leather. And so we want to use this process to blend these two pieces together and make this edge look really refined and polished. And so you can compare it to the finished edge there in the back. And so we're going to show you how we got there. So I use my fine tip paintbrush, and this is a very, tedious process, but it's absolutely worth it in the end. You want to be very careful. Don't apply too much pressure because you don't want to paint over the edge, because once this paint gets over, especially onto raw leather, it'll leave a stain. So if you're working on finished leather, you can easily wipe it off before it'll dry and you won't have any issues, just like I'm doing there, but that was on the raw side. So just make sure you're being very neat about it. You're going to have to go a little bit slower with the first layer because you're painting up against the surface that is not a slippery surface. It's very absorbent. It's basically sucking up this first coat of paint, but the more layers of paint that you add, it's easier to spread. So the pop process speeds up as you go. But on this first layer, just make sure you take time. I like to work on top of things where I can just wipe the paint off onto it and it won't be an issue for me. Like, just use my finger to wipe the paint up and just rub it right onto this paper I have down that you see here. Sometimes I use paper towel, but I always have things around where I can just wipe on them and it'll be no problem. So when I'm using a paintbrush, it picks up a lot of paint. And so I dotted down the line like this, just kind of spread it out a little bit so it just doesn't get globby and just too much paint in one spot. And then when you try to spread it, it'll eventually run over the edges. So just kind of spread it out a little bit before you actually use your strokes. And you want to do strokes as long and smooth as possible because, again, you don't want this paint to dry clumpy and have ridges and stuff in it. This is part of the process of making it easier for you on the end. If you start out doing things in a way where it's going to be smooth, then when you get to the very end, you're going to have the absolute best finished product. And so, like I said, this first coat it's going to be very transparent. It's going to dry down into the leather. The leather is going to absorb it. So you're going to have to come back in with a second coat. And just make sure you take your time. And this is also what I've noticed too. You want to make sure your edges are smooth before you start, as smooth as possible. because even when you burnish at the end, you're still going to be able to see like little knots and things if you have not made your edge smooth. And also, just from dipping this brush into the paint, it picks up little tiny air bubbles, and so you want to make sure that you go back and get those air bubbles out as well, because you're not going to be able to burnish those out on the end. And so here I'm about to go in with the second coat. You can see the first coat just basically suck that paint up. So we're going to finish up here. You can see at the very bottom of the screen where I've already started the second coat. And so we're just going to continue all the way around and cover this first coat with another coat of paint. Make sure in between your layers of paint that you let each layer dry thoroughly, because if you don't, it's going to be a mess. When you get to the end and you do your burnishing, and that pressure that you're putting on there to burnish that edge and smooth this paint out, it's going to start to rub the paint off. It's just going to be a blobby mess, and that is not what you want. So just be patient with the process. I said before, it's time consuming, but it is absolutely worth it in the end. This is the only way that I burnish, because there are not a lot of dyes that you can really use for this. And particularly for me and the way that I make my pieces, I like my bags to have continuity. I don't want there to be any disruption in the color unless it's actually part of the design, where you see a lot of bags have brown edges or they have black edges. There's a famous brand that uses red dye for their edges, but for me in particular, I think it just adds to the finish and the continuity of the piece to try to keep everything in the same color. And if you can't get the exact same color, just keep it close. And with Angela's paints, you can really blend these colors pretty well to get the custom color that you want. So here we're going in with the third coat. As you can see, that second coat is a little less transparent than the first coat, but you can still see that crevice, that separation in between the raw leather and the finished leather. And we're going to have to add coats until that is basically transparent. We want to get that gone. Okay, so we can just, it really takes your bags up to like the top notch, the creme de la creme of the, the leather bag making process. So we want to just take your time with it and go slowly. Make sure you're not leaving any air bubbles when you're dipping your brush in and painting this edge. Get all the air bubbles gone. Make sure there are no like little specks of color or anything, just that you may pick up from anywhere. Make sure you're keeping the edges nice and neat. Go slow. You can see it's spreading a little bit easier. And make sure that when you're doing this, make sure you're putting an even amount of paint with each layer. See, because when you spread it, see, sometimes you get like little spots where it's a little thinner in places than others. And just make sure you're just taking your time and spreading this out so everything is even. This is a process. You really have to do everything thoroughly the whole way through, because that is how you get the absolute best result. And another tip is, I'm most familiar with Angela's paints. That's what I work with generally. So if the paint that you're working with tends to be a thicker or thinner paint, that is going to affect how many layers that you may need. Sometimes if I'm working with a paint that's a little bit older, it's not as new, it's not as fresh, it's had time to kind of sit, and it's not as viscous, I don't have to put as many layers on. Sometimes I can get away with doing only 3 layers. And on this particular piece, I had to do 5. And that's just what you have to do. But I know when I open that paint up, I can pretty much gauge based on like the viscosity of the paint how many layers I'm going to have to put. White paints, I normally have to use a lot of those because they go down transparent, except for when the white paint is old, it gets thick, and I don't have to use as many layers. So, once you get familiar with this process and you use the different types of paints and you get more familiar with it, you'll be able to gauge from the beginning, like, how many layers you'll be able to do. But it's all about the finish that you're looking for. Me, I like a very clean finish, so I'm going to put as many layers as I need to, but I tend not to go over 5, because once you start getting too many layers, it gets cakey, and you will just be able to peel it off at the end, and you don't want that. You want to make sure these layers are dried down onto each other and it actually sticks to the leather. So yeah, we're going to speed this up a little bit for you. Just go ahead and knock this out and just get through this little phase of the process, and then we're going to take it over. Yeah, see, I'm covering this crack here. You can still see this crack. Look. Yeah, and it's just going to keep drying down in there, so you're going to have to keep adding layers to it. For those people who work with leather goods, you know it's already a tedious process as it is, so I'm sure you're prepared with lots of patience. Yeah, see here, you can still see the crack that's going down the center. Even though it's not translucent like how it was when I did that first and second layer, you can still see these little cracks that are visible. And that is what you also want to conceal. You want to make sure that that separation is completely hidden. Yeah. See, just look closely there. We want to get a very professional finish. So we're going in with another coat. This is the last coat. This is the 5th coat. Yeah, see, make sure there's an air bubble right there. Make sure we get that air bubble out. Yeah, because when you go back and burnish, well, those little pockets of air dry in there, you know, because this paint is really like rubbery. So it almost forms like a little cast like around the air bubble. It won't just like pop and then you can smooth it out. And like those bubbles, they stick, and you will be able to see those even after you burnish them and fire them and everything. So you want to make sure that you take your time to get everything smooth and neat and even. Okay. So this is the 5th layer we're doing. You can see, you can compare it to the strap on the right. It's still like little cracks you can see, but we're about to tighten all that up. And so just to give you a couple of tips real quick before we get into the next step. Typically, people burnish with beeswax. I used to use beeswax. And the reason that I switched over to using like a regular like white candle is because I ran out of beeswax one day and I said, hey, let me try this. And it ended up working better for me because these candles are not as soft as beeswax. They hold up better in room temperature as compared to beeswax. And when you go through the burnishing process, they don't just like melt as easily as beeswax does. They kind of give it a little bit more like they hold their finish better. You know, the residue of the wax kind of stays there a little bit better. And then after you fire it and you touch it, it doesn't have that like waxy, like residue-y type of a feel to it. So this is why I use the white candles. Personally, I would suggest that you stop using beeswax and use these white candles, but to each his own. You can try this and see how you like them. So make sure the candle, you know, it's just a plain white candle. No, nothing super expensive. Fragrance free is better. You want to make sure it doesn't have like any type of extra additives or anything like that in them. Just really like a basic candle. And really, I think the candles, if they're older, if they've like actually set out in your house before, they kind of work a little bit better because, you know, they've gotten to dry out a little bit more, and you kind of want a wax that's a little bit stiffer. So when you start to burnish it, it spreads, but it holds up against the burnishing, and it holds up against the firing when you do that at the very end. So yeah, we're coming down here with the last little bit of paint on this edge. See the bubbles there on the tip of the brush? Yeah, you want to make sure that you smear those out Again, this is very important. That's why I'm telling you, just to make sure, because if you want a really smooth edge, you're going to have to pay attention to things like that. Make sure there's no lint or nothing catching in your brush or anything like that. And wipe those edges if you're seeing anything running over. Just keep it very neat. Be very patient with the process. I promise you, at the end of the day, it is absolutely worth it. Trust me. Okay, so we're just going to finish up the edge over here. Going back and touching up where we have some little uneven spots in the paint, as you can see. Just be careful. Just do this process with care. That's really like the best tip I could give you. Just be patient and do it with care. Don't be sloppy. Be neat. Be alert. Yeah, okay, so here we are. That's the last layer. And even though you can kind of see it's still a little bit of like, you can see the crack like just a little bit. It's pretty much smooth for the most part. Everything's pretty much covered. Nothing is transparent. You can see this little piece right here. That was the 5th coat compared to that 4th coat. So yeah, the 5th coat right here. This is the 5th coat that we're doing, and this is a back shot that I'm giving you so you can really see on that top strap how it compares to like the 4th coat, where you can still see the little crack up there between the 2 pieces of leather that I put together. Now also, just to let you guys know, I glued these pieces of leather together, but I am going to absolutely sew them together as well. This is just a step in the process. And normally I would have sewn this together before I burnished them, but it had just happened to be more convenient for me where I was in my working space to just go ahead and do the burnishing before I put it under the sewing machine. So I'm going to sew these together. Just do not rely on glue to keep your pieces together. That is not smart. Okay. You gotta sew it too. Okay, so here we are. We're done. We've done the 5th coat on both straps. You can see that crevice is almost just invisible. Remember, you got to know your paint. You'll know when to stop when you get more familiar with the process. Again, for me, a lot of this was trial and error, and I'm sharing it with you. So now we're going to move into burnishing. Like I said, I use a regular white candle. Just something I had around my house, and now I use the white candles all the time. I prefer them. I don't use colored candles because the colors will rub off onto your paint and you will not be able to get it off, and then you'll feel away, and you don't want to ruin the hard work. So I just hold the strap like this, and I just go down the edge with the candle, you know, enough to apply some pressure where the wax rubs off, but not too hard where you're trying to like, you know, smudge the paint or rub the paint off. Now, again, make sure you do this when it's completely dry. And you see there, I got a little speck of something that was on that candle. It got into my little paint there. Just don't overlook that. You got to get those out, guys, because once you start burnishing, you will not be able to get those out, and then you're going to feel away, and you don't want that. Make sure, just pay attention when you're doing this. Take your time. If anything gets on that strap through this process, get it off right away. So I'm just going down the entire strap on both sides. I'm going to get the ends as well. Yep, there we go. And just make sure you get a good layer on there. It doesn't have to be too much, but like just enough. Like when you go back with your thumb and feel it, you'll know it's wax on there. And you'll be able to see it. And also during this process, the wax, it gets over the edge, so it doesn't just stay on the edge. It kind of gets a little bit on the sides as well. And you want to make sure that you go back and clean that up. And so I'll give you a close-up shot of that in a minute, just so you can see exactly what I'm referring to. But you really kind of have to be neat with this process, and not neat in the way where like you can't, make any mess. You just have to clean up right away when you do make the messes before you go on to the next step, because it makes a big difference. So here I'm showing you, you can't really see it too well, but if you look at the top, you can see a little like flakes, little from the wax here coming down at the bottom. You can see there in the inside, the little white flakes and stuff from the wax. And so here's my burnisher. Normally this inside part right here, inside part of the wheel right there, that's what most people burnish with. For me, I feel like it doesn't get the level of contact that I need. So I prefer to burnish with the edge. Now, some people may want to try burnishing, a hand burnishing tool, which may work for them particularly. I've started with a hand burnisher, so I've just kind of just roll with it. I prefer it, And so you want to hold the strap like you were when you were waxing it. Apply a good amount of pressure. It's going to be a little more challenging depending on how stiff your leather is. If it's not as stiff leather, like this leather is not super stiff because it's a strap, and the strap needs to be a little pliable so it can bend and adjust and things of that nature. So it's not quite as stiff, so it's going to be a little more difficult to apply the amount of pressure that you want to apply, but just get a good hold of it and just slide it up and down. And sometimes I like to tilt it just a little bit to get like on that edge of the wheel where it's really flat, because it smooths it out really nicely. And you want to just burnish until everything is smooth. Now here I am, I'm going back with the paper towel. I'm wiping down the edges, make sure I'm getting all that excess wax off. It's important when you start firing these up. Now, I'll use a wind-resistant lighter because you can actually, the flame comes to a point, and, if you use a regular lighter, if you try to turn the lighter in a different direction, the flame is always going to point upward. But not with these. The flame is going to go where you direct it. But they get very hot. They burn very quickly. So you got to make sure when you do this, you go down fast and you don't get too close, because it will burn and it will leave a little soot. And depending on what you're working with, because you can also use suede in this process, like you can glue the suede onto a thicker piece of leather that's more sturdy, and you can still burnish the edge of something that's suede, but it will burn your suede. So you got to make this process a very swift process with the lighter. And what this does, that wax adds that seal, it makes it even more water resistant, and it helps with that extra finish so it doesn't start to peel off. It protects it so other colors and just daily wear and tear, it won't rub off onto the color on these edges and start to make them dirty and scuff them up and things of that nature. So it's just a really good way to keep it protected. But see, you look at that edge, butter, can't beat it. It's smooth. You cannot beat it. I'm telling you, you would not know the difference between burnishing this way. Look at that shine on there. You can't beat that, bruh. You cannot beat that.